Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to episode 2 of Renew and Renovate. Last week, we introduced the text Romans 12, 1 and 2, and today we're going to begin to unpack that text and begin to look at what Paul was communicating of the deep truth that he expected that would impact our lives. And today we're going to focus on the mercies of God. And one of the texts from outside of Romans that I believe kind of gives us a good idea of the importance of mercy would be the parable of the king and his servants in Matthew 18. Trey, could you unpack that? Could you give us a little synopsis of that parable for anyone that's not familiar with it or might need some reminder?
And, I'm a storyteller. I love the parables. Kids love parables. And I always tell kids a parable is an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. So if you want to use those hand signs, you can with your grandkids or whoever. So this parable is found in Matthew 18, and it's the unmerciful servant. And it's going to say here in a minute, 10,000 talents of gold. Now, 1 talent of gold was about 20 years' wages. So I've gone ahead and done the math, and I will replace the modern equivalent dollar signs. Now, it was said in gold and silver in the Bible, but I think this may give you a little more context. And again, I'm going to retell the story or summarize it, not read it word for word. And so it starts off with Peter asking about how many times he should forgive his brother. And Jesus says, not 7 times, but 77. And some say 70 times 7. So then he says, the kingdom of heaven is like a king. And so this king was going to settle his debts. And this one guy came forward and he owed $2.9 billion. So he owed $2.9 billion to the king. And he was able to pay. And the master said, okay, we're going to take you and your family. We're going to put you in prison until you can repay. And he fell on his knees. He begged for forgiveness. And the king, they took pity on him and he canceled the entire debt. So $2.9 billion, that's like equivalent to my student loan debts. I would feel very happy if those were canceled. Now, the servant then goes and meets a lesser servant who owes him $58. And he grabs him and he chokes him and he says, pays me what you owes me. And he cannot. And so he takes him, and that guy begs, and he doesn't matter. He throws him in prison. And when the master finds out, he has the first servant brought back in, and he says, why did you do this? I canceled your debts. You should have had mercy on your fellow servant, just as I had mercy on you. And the king threw him over to the jailer and until he could pay back everything that he owed. And then it ends with 35. It says, this is how my heavenly Father will treat each of you unless you forgive your brother or sister from your heart.
So I love that parable. I think it, without saying it outright, and to maybe add in a little bit, it sounds like Jesus is saying, here's the kingdom economy. When those who have received mercy should be extending mercy. And Paul starts this passage out in Romans 12, appealing to their recognition of God's mercy. So what are some of the things? This is a great parable. There's a lot there that we could get into, but what in this parable do y'all think really speaks to and demonstrates the mercy that God has shown us and that he expects us to show others?
Well, I think it starts with just the idea that God has forgiven us a lot, right? And that's huge. That we just start with that understanding that we have all sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, as Paul likes to tell us in Romans 3. And that as we think about that we have been forgiven much, but also that we recognize that we're not like the Pharisee who prayed very arrogantly and pridefully, Lord, I thank you, but I'm not like other men, the rest of people. And pats himself on the back, all the good things he does. But we all have stuff in our lives, moments in our lives, stories, maybe even seasons of our lives that we weren't who we should have been. We were the prodigal son. And for us to recognize that God has forgiven us a great deal. And even in that story that we know where the woman crashes the party and washes Jesus' feet with her hair and her tears. And Jesus, says to Simon the Pharisee in that story, look, she has been forgiven much and she loves me much. And I think it's not so much that Well, she's done a whole lot more, but I think a big part of it is just a recognition of my sins and my forgiveness that shapes me to love much versus when I don't feel like I've really done anything. So that elevates me and makes me prideful, and I don't recognize how merciful God has been to me versus in this story where it's like it's crystal clear 10,000 in the new NIV translation is 10,000 bags of silver. That's like, oh my word, that's a lot of silver. So we've been forgiven a lot. And as Jesus said elsewhere, freely you have received, freely give. We've received forgiveness freely. We need to give forgiveness freely.
Hmm. Yes, and that is a big amount of money that was owed, and we owe a lot. And if you want to check my math, it's 10,000 years times 20 years times minimum wage, 40 hours a week, 50 hours a year. I gave them 2 weeks vacation, which was charitable, although at minimum wage, you may not be able to afford it. That's how you up with $2.9 billion. And I think this is very much a human nature story in that I always feel deserving when I'm forgiven or when someone's kind to me. And I have often in my life struggled with being that older brother, of being annoyed when it's, oh, he didn't earn that. I remember what you did. You know, there's a thing in modern culture now called cancel culture, if you're not familiar. And it's a thing that people dig up stuff from the past of people who are celebrities or public figures or just private citizens now, and they pull it out of context and they get them in trouble in the modern sense. And that is, there's no forgiveness in that. It doesn't matter if you've changed your opinion on the topic. It doesn't matter if you've, between the time that came out and then now that you've publicly apologized and reconciled. And so we need to be looking to be that 7 times 70. And, you know, that number calls out to a Hebrew audience. That's an allusion to the guy who's probably holds the record for maybe the most vicious guy in the Old Testament, a guy named Lamech, who's Cain's great, sixth great grandson. And he said, if you hurt me, I will kill you. If you wound me, I will kill you. And that's human nature too, because when there's a conflict, first you come with a fist, then you come back with a stick, then you come back with a knife, then you come back with a gun, and things escalate that way. If you do not, things could be so much nicer to forgive after the fist stage, you know, or after the word stage before the fist stage. And so I think it doesn't surprise me that people want to hold on to things because it's a wound to themselves or someone they love. Even I've known people who can let people, they can be a doormat, but you do something to their wife or their mom or someone they love, and they will hold on to that for a lifetime.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. What I hear y'all saying is that Jesus and Paul through the parables and Paul through Romans 12, the first part of verse 1, really put things into context. Trey, you mentioned that people pull things out of context, and what we have with Jesus is putting into context God's expectations of forgiveness and mercy that we extend to others. In this parable, I love that it's almost so obvious that not even I can miss the significance of it, that the first servant was forgiven of a huge sum of money, and then he goes out and grabs his fellow servant by the throat and demands his money. So I have to wonder, how often do I live my life like that? So what do y'all think is, Trey, you mentioned the human nature. What do you think are the human tendencies that would cause that first servant and us to act so mercilessly and so ungraciously and unforgiving when we've been forgiven, if we truly believe that we have, when we've been forgiven of so much, and we claim to really understand what we've been forgiven of? What is it how is it that we get off track or get caught up in ourselves that we act like that first servant?
I think a lot of it is just our, whether or not you want to call it selective amnesia or whatever, that we forget our own shortcomings. We forget what we have done. And I'll just use a quick example of when we're driving down the road that someone pulls out in front of us, or maybe they cut over in front of us in order to slam on their brakes and make a left turn, and we have to stop for them, or right turn, or whatever it is. Or maybe someone does pull out in front of us, and we act as if we have never ever done any of those things. Oh, I forgot to turn on my blinker, or I didn't notice, I didn't see you. I almost hit you because I was distracted by something. And I can remember doing that one time for sure, where I pulled out right in front of the car that came past me, and the lady, we both stopped, and we were both, I'm sure our hearts were racing, because she was able to go around me because it was a wide road. And she just mouthed at me, what were you thinking? And I mouthed back at her. It's like, I did not see you. But how did I respond the next time that happened to me? That someone pulled out in front of me, either not seeing me, or they did see me, they did it anyway. And I think we have a tendency, I'd use that as an example, that we act as if, there's no sin here in my camp. It's all out there on everybody else. So I really think ultimately that's where it starts, is that we're so forgetful of our own shortcomings, instead of living with a constant sense of humility that, what, if I were with Jesus, with the woman being accused, I would have to put down my stone and walk away, because I'm not without sin. And we know it, but in the moment we act as if we don't know it.
Yeah. And over in the Bible, you hear forgive as God forgave you. And, I remember studying in grad school, the exact same thing Randy just said. They call it the fundamental attribution error. It's like the number one mistake people make when they're judging other people's actions. And it means when I make a mistake, I blame it on the circumstances. When you make a mistake, I blame it on your personality and your disposition.
Yeah.
And so the only way to get around that is to put yourself in their shoes. And that's not what your gut instinct is when someone cuts you off. It's to be like, what are you, come on, what are you thinking? But then when you're the one who does that, you're thinking, oh, my kids were yelling and the thing, I dropped my thing. And so I think the only way around that is to remind ourselves that what God said is forgive as God forgave you. That means you put yourself in a different position. And if someone cuts you off in traffic, say, okay, if I were that guy, what would I want to hear? Why would I have done that? If they cut you off, it's like, are they in a hurry? Are they having a bad day? Did their boss yell at them? All of those are the reasons that I might cut someone off in traffic, although my boss would never yell at me, I'm sure. But people don't think that way. Yeah, you got your halo with you. And so I think empathy is a very fundamental thing. And people, you feel grateful when you're forgiven. Hopefully you can pass that on. And what's amazing is it's good for you. A lot of the times you need to be forgiving in a situation where the other person doesn't even need to know about it. Okay. Because if you hold on to any of those things, it's not just forgiving someone else isn't condoning that behavior. It's forgiveness. It's also getting it out of yourself. I had a friend who said, like, when you don't forgive, you let someone live in your head rent free. And so like they're in your head, they're in there, they're annoying you. They're taking up your bandwidth. They're making you mad. Here's the thing. That other person is out there water skiing. They're having hot dogs. They ain't thinking about you at all. Okay. So forgiveness is good for you. It's a way also to restore a relationship if you need to, but you can forgive and then work on restoring after that. They can be two separate things, because that's just how it is. And so you forgive them just to help get something off your chest. And then the next time that way you'll put yourself in a position to be taken advantage, 76 more times, because without putting yourself back in that relationship over and over and over again, the other person is not going to learn from you anything, and you're not going to have a chance to rub off on them at all.
Oh, absolutely. You mentioned empathy, Trey. I think for me, when I look at my behavior or my unforgiveness and my lack of showing mercy, it's because I happen to be caught up in myself at that particular moment, and I'm not being empathetic. I'm not thinking of other people you know, God's truth really brings perspective and brings a order and reason and logic to the way we live, the way we think, the way we respond to the world around us. And there are times that we should be thinking about ourselves. In context to this passage in Romans 12, Paul's saying, be cognizant of the mercies that you've received from God. And part of that is not just God not dropping the hammer on us, but it's also the compassion, the way he was moved to act on our behalf. And Paul really seems to believe that this is a solid ground for the instruction that he's going to give in the rest of verse 1 and verse 2, where he says, therefore I urge you by the mercies, brethren, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in the view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. That's a real strong call that is built upon a very solid foundation of God's mercy and compassion for us, that moves us to be empathetic and to think of others above ourselves. And we're gonna unpack that in the next few weeks as we get deeper into this text. But today, I think is really important that we dig in and get a good understanding of what God's mercy is, because Paul seems to think it's compelling to everything that follows. So why do y'all think it's important that we really understand what God's mercy means to us?
For me, it's taking the conversation we've already started by just looking at the story of the servant who wasn't forgiving, wasn't merciful, and it's next level. So now we've been talking about this idea of perspective. I need to remind myself that I have faults, that I've made mistakes, that I do the very things that may at times irk me when somebody else does it. And just as Trey said, I find reasons to excuse my bad behavior because of circumstances, but I look at somebody else and it's his character, they're just a terrible person. There is perspective that we need to bring into this, but Paul is always saying the perspective that we need as people who live by faith and claim that Jesus is Lord is the perspective of the cross and perspective of what Jesus did for each and every one of us, and the call to follow his example and to walk in his footsteps and to treat others the way he has treated us in absolutely everything. And in the same way that he, in Ephesians 4 and 5, that we're to be imitators of God, live a life of love just as Christ loved us and gave himself as a fragrant offering to God, that we would live such a life. And that perspective is supposed to change everything, absolutely everything for us, but we have to keep that moment, that truth and that reality constantly in front of us, not in the back of our mind, but in the front of our minds. The writer of Hebrews 12, fix your eyes on Jesus. And again, points to the example of what he did in his suffering on the cross. And so for us to keep our eyes on Jesus, remember his love to us and to everyone, so that we are shaped by that and move to go, wow, he did that for me. Jesus, the Son of God, did that for me. And in the grand scheme of things, I'm not really that significant. I'm not really that important, but I was that important to God. I was that important to Jesus. And that we would have that same attitude and mindset towards everybody else around us in the same way.
Yeah, I think another reason to always be merciful, if you're looking at things from a kingdom perspective, is, you look at the context of the parable in Matthew 18. No one owes a king $3 billion just for like fines or something. It seems to be an illusion that he was likely a tax collector for the king, and it was his job to bring that to the king. So, he's in the wrong. He didn't do what he's supposed to do. Maybe he pocketed it. Maybe he was lazy. It doesn't matter. He's shorted the king. He has let the king down. And in parables, the king is always God. And so then he's forgiven. Okay. When God forgives the first man, he's like, I want you on the team. Come on, get back to helping me. Get back to the mission. Okay. Forget that mistake. Get back to the mission. And then that man comes upon another servant, and he takes that guy out of the kingdom. That second servant will never add anything to the kingdom. And when you don't forgive someone, you can very easily impede their ability to grow, to give things to the kingdom. And if you do forgive them, you can egg them on. There's no military in the world that kicks people out of boot camp the first time they don't polish their boots right. No, you say, no, that's not right. You get them back on task and keep going. I guarantee you, all the greatest generals in history at some point had to do push-ups because they had messed something up. Okay. Now, you're not the general, you're not the king, but you are you're part of the kingdom, and it's your job to help bubble up people so they can grow up. And if you don't forgive them, they won't learn that lesson. They won't get a chance to move on. They'll be put in that spiritual prison, or they'll say, well, I don't want anything to do with that kingdom. What I tried to do was just thrown away.
Yeah. Hey, Mike, let me throw something else as you were telling that story, Trey. It reminded me of that moment for those of you that are Les Mis fans out there. But where the priest, if you recall, Jean Valjean has stolen from the priest the silver from his house and disappeared. And so when he's caught by the authorities and they bring him to the priest to have him accused and have him arrested, and the priest is like, friend, you left in such a hurry, you forgot to take this too. And he gives him some more stuff. And the authorities, thank you for arresting him, but I gave these things to him. And that's all a lie. Priest is lying to the authorities, but he's doing something for Jean Valjean. He's showing him mercy and showing him compassion. And this man has never known this before. He's never known mercy. He's never known compassion. And it changes his life. And that is, I think, just a small sample of what you're talking about, Trey, that if we would show people mercy and compassion, we let people see Jesus through us, because Jesus is living in us, we would say. We believe this is true. And if we would just be faithful in that, to show mercy, to show compassion, to show what self-sacrifice looks like, we can make Jesus look beautiful to people, because they're not going to see him apart from mercy and compassion being given to them through his people living on the earth today. And so to your point again, Trey, we have a privilege and we have a duty to our King to be his ambassadors and to forgive, again, as we've been forgiven, so that people's hearts are moved, broken, opened to the glorious love of God.
Absolutely. For me, I think of Jesus's prayer in John 17 and what Peter says on Pentecost, where Jesus in his prayer says, I ask this not only for these, but those who will believe in you through their word. And then Peter's talking to the people who ask, what must we do to be saved? And he's saying, this is not just for you, but for your descendants, for all that are going to come after you. And we have that same continuity, that same mercy with a purpose, and which, the gospel is not arbitrary. God sent his son. His mercy had a purpose. His mercy was meant to be the catalyst to that return of his people to him, to that garden relationship, to that unity and that restoration of what God's creation and his design. And so it's important for me to recognize how much and how God has shown his mercy to me for a purpose, so that I will be compelled to show it to others for that same purpose, so that the same salvation that came to me through his mercy will also be extended, as Trey was saying, to the people around me. And that won't happen if I don't have an understanding of God's mercy and an understanding of my sin. I think of what Paul said in 1 Timothy 1, I believe it's 15. This is a trustworthy saying, that Christ came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief. And, I don't think Paul is saying that he was the worst sinner to ever live. just like I don't mean that when I say I'm chief among sinners. But what I am saying is that I grievously fell short, and I continue to fall short. And the mercies of God weren't a one and done thing. Christ is continually in heaven going before the Lord on my behalf, and his blood is continually cleansing me. And if I do appreciate what he has done for me, then I need to be extending that same mercy and compassion to those around me. I believe that to a larger and more significant eternal degree, that is what God's mercy does for us. He extends us his word, his instruction, his promises, Randy, as you mentioned. All of these things are compelling to dig into or to lean into the calling that Paul makes to the Romans and to us to offer ourselves as living sacrifices. So how do y'all think we can do that in a world that really doesn't believe that truth is an objective thing, that the Bible or scripture's outdated? It's you can kind of manipulate it or shape it to suit yourself.
Well, the matter of how you're supposed to live your life, and if we want to say ridicule or rejection of the Bible as scripture, as something that is of God and is how we ought to live our lives, this is not anything new. We don't need to sit back and think this is a modern phenomenon. We see the same kind of ridicule and scorn heaped upon the Jews, God's people of long ago, for holding to their beliefs and their convictions. We see that in the life of the early church. We see the teaching and even the belief system of the Christians that Jesus has been raised back to life being ridiculed. Again, this was in ancient times, in the times where they believed in all kinds of gods that we would say are the false gods and worshiping of idols. But Christians in that age had to do the same thing, live by faith, putting their trust in God, listening to Jesus, listening to the teachings of God, and walking in those ways, even though others didn't. And we look at the story of Noah, and we look at, again, just go through again, Hebrews chapter 11, all of those people who lived by faith when nobody else was. And that it isn't a new thing. And so I think for us, how do we do it? We just do what everybody's always done, live by faith, not by sight. And we put our trust in God and say, I'm going to follow Jesus. I don't care what the cost is. And the cost that Jesus paid to come to seek and save us was high. And so it shouldn't bother us that he would have a high calling on our lives. And in fact, it ought to be something that we respond to with a sense of privilege, that I have an opportunity to show Jesus how much I love him and to do something for him, the one who's done so much for me.
Yeah. The issue of truth in this like post-truth world we're living in is tough. And you're called to a high bar to be a Christian, to live according to truth. Now, I think we are pretty well grounded as if you're a church rat like me, if you've been going to church for a while, about what the Bible's truth is. And I understand we talked a lot in these Bible classes about how there's difference of interpretation, even between the three of us. And of course, then you expand that to a church or the world. But there's certain parts of that we all agree on, the broad strokes, which are the most important things. Now, you're living in a post-truth world, and you're confronted with someone who does not accept that truth. I think what you need to do in today's day and age, and probably always been true, is first come at that with a loving spirit. To correct someone is difficult. And if they already don't think you're cool, if they already don't think you're wise or nice, then you're going to not help yourself at all. And they're not going to listen to you because you are offering something that conflicts with their worldview. And just think how you would be if someone knocked on your door and tried to get you to convert to something else. I don't even want to hear your sales pitch. Once they get, a few syllables out, you're like, okay, thank you. If you're not selling Girl Scout cookies, you keep going. And so we're in that same boat, except we have the truth. Okay, we have something very special. We have the light, and you're the light of the world. We're supposed to share that on. And I think when you're trying to share the truth, you got to first do it in a loving way. Every person you talk to, if you're trying to share with them a truth that you think they're living in a sinful way, in your heart, I hope you're thinking, I want this person saved from hell. I want this person's life to be better. And I believe that's where your heart is. But that's not what people are going to hear if you don't come at it first with your own failings, your own saying, hey, God wants you on his team. God's going to forgive everyone. He's forgiven me the things I've done. And that's the thing that happens in a relationship, not with a poster board that you wave. That happens in conversations over time, not in one tweet. And so if you're going to confront the truth, you're going to first need to build strong relationships. You need to be a servant to the world. And we talked was it this last week, if not at some point, about the sheep and the goats. If you're not on the side that's giving out water, visiting sick people, bringing food to people, you're on the wrong side of that division. And that means your testimony, your desire to help people is weakened by that. And that's much harder than a tweet. That's much harder than writing up a poster board. But if you're going to try to be a light towards truth in the world, you have to deliver that truth the way the original messenger did. When Jesus delivered the truth, yes, he confronted sometimes, but of course, he confronted different people differently. Mm-hmm. He confronted a woman accused of adultery, soft, quietly, writing in the dirt. Other people one-on-one, and he confronted other people, Pharisees and other people in a very confrontational way. And so don't confuse the woman at the well with a group of Pharisees in your tactics of how to deliver the truth. Start off. In fact, I would consider, side on the loving side always, and, let them escalate if they have to. But I don't know. Truth is hard, and it's hard to live by the truth, and it's even harder to share it in a way that's accepted because you have to be authentic.
As Randy, when we were talking earlier, you mentioned Esther. It's not that God can't accomplish it another way. But if we believe in his mercy, why would we not capitalize on the opportunities to be a part of what he's doing in people's lives?
Right.
And that's what we're going to get into next week is that offering our bodies as living sacrifices. And that instruction is built on some depth and some really built on who God is. If all through the Psalms, or not all through the Psalms, but many places in the Psalms where it talks about God's mercy, truth is right there beside it. It is always connected to who God is, and by extension, who we are becoming. So I look forward to next week, getting into that topic. But do y'all have any closing thoughts for us as we wrap this session up?
Yeah, let me share with you, with everybody, one of the passages of scripture that's kept coming into my mind as we've been reflecting on Romans 12, verse 1, in view of God's mercies, offer your bodies as a living sacrifice. This is 2 Corinthians 5, verses 14 and 15, where Paul says, Christ's love compels us because we are convinced that one died for all, and therefore all died. And he died for all, that those who live should no longer live for themselves, but for him who died for them and was raised again. And I think for Paul, it comes back to what we were talking about earlier about perspective. Paul is constantly saying our perspective should always be Christ and the cross. And this is a passage that I think is saying a lot of the same things that Romans 12, verse 1 is saying, that we're going to live for the one who died for us and was raised again. And that means sacrifice. It means putting others in front of, and others' interests in front of our own. It means being merciful. It means being compassionate. It means being humble. It means turning the other cheek. It means all the things that Trey was talking about a second ago. And everything that we've all been talking about this whole time. But it's in view of God's mercies. Christ's love compels us. And so this is the motivating factor that drives us to be humble servants of the Lord and to offer our bodies as a living sacrifice.
Yeah, I guess my last thought is to bring us back to renew and renovate. You've maybe none of us have been perfect up to this point, but we can be renewed. We can renovate, and you can be proactive in that. You can say to yourself, "Have I always let people come seeking forgiveness from me, from something they've done wrong?" If that's the case, that's normal for humans, but that's not what we need called to do. If someone has wronged you, you be proactive in forgiving them. You can forgive them in your heart and then work on restoring that relationship or letting them know you're forgiving them and bringing them back together. But it's common for you to get into a rut. Whenever you see a building show, they're always going to like tear it down and build up a new house around it. They always say, "Well, it's got good bones. It's got good bones," and you've got good bones. Okay, you may need to have a new coat of paint put on you, and you may need to pull off some old wiring. But God is ready to renew you and to renovate you and to help you have that metamorphosis that you need to be a merciful person.
We all both said more eloquently what I was going to say. I was just going to say that the mercy of God really demonstrates to me my need to be renewed and renovated, and that we have, because of his confidence, because we can be assured that he is merciful and compassionate towards us, that we're not in that alone, that he is with us every step of the way as we're being renewed and transformed as Paul's calling us to be. Well, gentlemen, brothers, I thank y'all so much. I'm looking forward to getting together again next week and really digging into what Paul is now going to call us to, the action that he's going to call us to. Thank you
God
all.
bless everybody.